Welcome to the Luchi in Muttons podcast. I am Surabhi, your host. I run Luchi in Muttons Dog Behavior and Nutrition, a canine care practice based out of India. I work very closely with dog parents across the world and help them meet their dog's nutritional and behavioral needs. My approach is grounded in science and empathy and humility and curiosity to learn from our dogs. Welcome to episode number 16. This one is an interesting episode. I actually recorded this as a Facebook Live, and then I decided that it was such a valuable conversation that I wanted to create a podcast episode out of this. So, in this episode, I chat with Soniksha. She is a relational psychotherapist, and we talk about attachment and attachment in dogs and in humans and the types of attachment and why we struggle to sometimes form secure attachments, but why anxious attachments or avoidant attachment styles also have their place in relationships. And so it's a conversation that's filled with lots and lots of insight and learning, hopefully. I hope you enjoy this. Just a quick heads up, since it was a live, there were people who were attending the live and they shared, of course, their comments and thoughts. And I've repeated some of those comments and thoughts in this episode. Hopefully, those will also add value to your listening experience. Hope you enjoy this episode and see you soon with a new episode in 2 weeks. I actually wanted to really zoom out first and start by talking about like why is attachment important, right? And also because I feel like what's happened is that um, I think with just mainstream narrative or just like pop culture, I feel like attachment has become like this really wishy-washy, soft kind of a word, which comes with a lot of different like perceptions and connotations. It's not as much of like a hard concept as, let's say, discipline and obedience and control and the context that I'm bringing is that it definitely comes up a lot in the way that we care for dogs and the kind of relationships that we build with them. Um, but attachment also serves very like important functional quote unquote perspectives for human beings. And so, can you tell us a little bit about that? Like, why is it important?
I mean, to begin with, I don't think attachment is meant to be hard. I think
Mm,
it's meant to be soft. Uh, when you said why isn't attachment important, the first thing that came to my mind was this very well-known experiment in psychology around attachment. I'm not going to go into too many details around it, but the idea is you have baby monkeys, and one group is placed with a wire monkey, and one group is placed with a monkey made out of cloth and soft materials. And the monkeys
mm,
inevitably choose, the baby monkeys choose the one that's made out of cloth. So I
mm,
think things like discipline, control, they sound hard because they are hard. I think they come in at a much later stage. But
mm,
initially, it's meant to be soft, it's meant to be cloth and cushiony.
mm,
And I think that way, attachment, even the word, right, it evokes very biophysical images of clinging,
mm,
grabbing, holding,
mm,
touching. Uh,
mm,
and those are soft experiences. They can also be hard, that is not to say. But um, those are my first. Those were my first few thoughts, and the second one was I think everything is political, and I think of care also as something that can be political in that there is a politics in care. And
mm,
when care is emerging from a space of wanting to control, that's when we move towards discipline and obedience. But
mm,
whereas when we look at care as about building something, fostering something, and creating something, it won't really be about control as much as it'll be about spontaneity and responding, as
mm,
opposed to dictating something. So that way,
mm,
attachment, I think, is something that's uh, a response to spontaneity or a lack of. if that makes sense. In
Hmm.
that, um, there's a psychoanalyst called Winnicott who really
Hmm.
revolutionized the idea of mothers in psychoanalysis. Before his work came in, they were quite in the sidelines in theories. And he has amazing things to say, but one of the things he talks about in terms of what is a good enough mother is just a mother who's present and able to be spontaneous,
Hmm.
in the sense that there's no predetermined set of responses or rituals, but it comes up
Hmm.
every time the baby or a dog presents a
Hmm.
need. And
Hmm.
every time a need may not be met in the same way. The need for a
Hmm.
need to be met could also vary. Right? A
Hmm.
dog may not want connection simply in the form of play, maybe play 1 minute and being pet the next or being held the next. Um,
Hmm.
so just because a dog in this case is, let's say, reaching out for connection, it doesn't mean it has to be the same form of connection every time. So to sort
Yeah.
of be able to read that, that requires a presence and a certain kind of spontaneity. It requires you to
Hmm.
kind of not be um, attached to a prefixed idea of what it means to
Hmm.
care for somebody. Um,
Hmm.
yeah, but circling back to why attachment is important, I think attachment is a prerequisite to survival. Um,
Hmm.
right? Like
Hmm.
within the animal world or even with humans, uh, babies need to be around their caregivers. Newborns need to
Hmm.
be around their caregivers. They need to be attached because without that attachment, um, actually, what coming to my mind is I think attachment is the psychological equivalent of an umbilical cord, right?
Hmm. Hmm.
Like that's what feeds you, supports you when you're in the womb, and then you get out of
Hmm.
the womb. And you don't have an
Yeah.
umbilical cord anymore, but you need to be attached to the caregiver. And I
Hmm.
think that's what attachment is. Um,
Hmm. Yeah. Yeah. You said a lot of really interesting things, which I'm going to use later as quotes to get people to watch the live whenever they're up and about in different parts of the world. But um, I think you talked about like attachment when you were talking about the experiment with monkeys. You talked about attachment being like soft and cushiony. And so, like, is attachment cushioning us from something? Does it have the ability to cushion us from things?
I think so. I
And I think, like,
think,
yeah, I think that goes
sorry,
back to like the
continue.
question of, I think that goes back to the question of like what happens if there is no attachment. So then, what is attachment cushioning us from?
I mean, psychologically, I can say this for humans. I'm not so sure where that would stand with animals, but being alive is a terrorizing thing,
Mm,
right? Um, Coming into the world is a terrorizing thing. You start
mm,
out life in the womb where it's dark. There is something like water. You're held. You don't have to move around much. It's pretty hushed. And then, boom, bam, you are in a hospital room with bright
yeah.
lights and beeping machines and loud noises, and everything is a threat. Babies are cushioned. Why are babies swaddled?
Mm,
Right? That's a cushioning. That is cloth. And they're swaddled tightly, but they're swaddled because they need to feel like they're held and they're in something that's
mm,
keeping them safe. So I think
mm,
on a psychological level, attachment is a cushioning from the terrors of being alive. It makes being alive somewhat bearable.
mm,
When you can find that sort of, like, it's a refuge. I think when we're constantly saying it is cushioning. It's. I'd like to think of it as a bed you get into after a long,
yeah,
tired day, right?
yeah,
Um,
yeah,
it has the potential. I don't think all kinds of attachment feel like that, but I think that is the wish in wanting to be
mm,
attached or being attached to somebody.
mm,
Um,
mm.
and yeah,
Yeah, yeah. No, that makes a lot of sense. I think the sense of like attachment, um, the wish for attachment to provide this kind of like security and comfort. Especially, and I resonate with you. I feel like even in general, I think yes, the world being you talked about being alive is terrorizing, but I think the world in general is very scary.
Yeah.
There are just so many things all the time, and you can sort of create microcosms of it, right? And we see that with different dogs, particularly dogs who are extremely anxious and fearful and even reactive, right? Where seemingly non-threatening triggers can feel very threatening to
Yeah.
them. um, and in the face of those triggers, what brings security and comfort? And I suppose that is that kind of attachment to a caregiver. And you used mothers, but I'm going to use like caregivers in general because again,
Sure.
in the
Yeah.
context of dogs, I think it comes down to caregiving per se, irrespective of the gender of it, perhaps. And so you also happen to mention that like in most kinds of attachment, this is what would happen, right? This kind of cushioning is what one would experience. um and do you want to talk a little bit about like just I suppose because again, right, I think the literature on attachment and especially all the work done by Bowlby, etc., they talk about types of attachment, right? And I think the type of attachment that you were referring to, as much as I imagine we don't like to box things or categorize things per se, seems to fall under the definition of what we would call secure attachment, right?
Mhm.
But then there are also other types of attachment. So can you tell us a little bit about that as well?
Um, that's interesting because I think um, the three main types of attachment that Bowlby talks about, which is secure, insecure, and anxious, avoidant, anxious, avoidant.
Yeah.
But I think it's also so much, like you said, it's difficult to box things in, and that's also because it's complicated. Because I think these three styles also really go to show the um, relationships with experiences like separation,
Mm,
anger, hurt,
mm,
the
mm,
hope or the assurance that something broken can be repaired, right?
mm,
So I think in that sense, the way I would, if I wouldn't be pompous enough to say redefine, but at least the way I have recategorized it in my mind
mm,
is I think secure attachment is where there is faith that the person you are attached to will return, where
mm,
separation feels bearable. Right? An
mm,
insecure attachment or an anxious attachment rather is where you understand that somebody has to leave, but it makes you upset and angry, but there's also room to express that disappointment and then move towards a
mm,
repair. And then your complete
mm,
avoidant is, I would say, there's no attachment in the first place because then a separation just feels like utter death. It feels like having
mm,
been abandoned. Perhaps there's no hope that you can also express that hurt and rage. And so you just completely turn away and towards yourself. And that's really the
mm,
interesting thing psychologically that babies or infants who are unable to, I think, find that attachment with their caregivers, they turn inwards. They become their own caregiver or their own world
mm,
in a very sort of, if I'm to use a clinical term, narcissistic kind of personality structure, where the world is not meeting my needs, so I'm going to be the world
mm,
that meets my needs. That's a lot of rage
mm,
at the world
mm,
and not having been able to attach yourself to something. Um,
mm.
so I think when we talk attachment, we can't do it without also talking about separation.
Yeah, yeah.
Because at some point while you were speaking, I was also thinking about the
Mm,
leash with dogs.
mm, mhm,
It is a way to keep your dog tethered to you,
mhm,
right? But the only, I suppose, from whatever I've observed, uh, it's not just as a caregiver testing out the environment whether it's safe enough to let the dog off leash, but it's also having faith in your dogs and your dog having faith in you in the bond and attachment that you share, where they'll respond to you, you'll respond to them.
Yeah.
That you can bear to let them off leash, but also more importantly, I suppose they can bear to be off leash and be
Off
curious and
leash. Yeah.
explore, right?
Yeah.
And there's another psychologist, psychoanalyst who's worked a lot on attachment, Margaret Marlowe, who talks about how the safety in attachment is knowing you can leave, but that you have some place to return to.
Mm.
And I think that's because I'm talking, and that's the image that's coming to me is pretty much, I suppose, what the experience of being off leash is for
Yeah.
the dog. Right?
Yeah.
Knowing that I can wander off, but this caregiver is here to come get me, or I can run to if I need, and I'm going to come
Yeah.
back here. And that comes from having a secure attachment or some attachment where there's faith that I'm not being
Yeah.
abandoned or my dog's not going to run away from me or whatever, you
Yeah.
know.
Yeah.
Um,
Yeah. Yeah. Absolutely. I mean, I'm actually struggling to like pick the thread that I want to deep dive into because there are like so many different threads uh in my brain as you spoke about. And I think yes, absolutely. So okay, let me like go, bit by bit because I'm also now struggling to like articulate everything that I'm thinking about.
do it
I
whatever was
love,
first evoked in you.
yeah, I mean, I think I was just thinking about how I've always said this. I've always said that I find like the way that we approach our relationships with our dogs at Barks is very, relational, psychological, as opposed to, like CBT, which is perhaps more anchored in like behavior modification, right?
Hmm.
And thoughts to behavior kind of process. And so I think when you were talking about the leash example, I was just like, oh my God, yes, yes, yes. And it just felt like a really higher level of what we do or how I
Mhm.
support clients in getting to that place. But I think that uh, absolutely, I think that even when I think about examples where I have worked with clients to help them walk their dogs outside, I think a big part, and I don't do that necessarily in the first conversation. I do that much, much later in the consultation because the first part of the consultation, the foundation really is to say, how can we help you build more safety and connection in your relationship first with your dog, right? Because that needs to be, and I think it goes back to what you said about attachment just being so basic to survival. Like that needs to exist first in all its ways and forms. And there needs to be faith, there needs to be trust that your dog will respond to you and that you will respond to your dog, right? In
Yeah.
all its many ways.
And I think that's
Um,
where that bit about the politics of care comes in, right? Because when you're
mm,
trying to control your dog or discipline your dog, which is what most of the trainers do,
yeah,
there's not much that is being focused on in terms of building faith and trust and making room for the dog being a sentient being, right?
yeah,
Um, and you wouldn't really care about that because what you want is when you say sit, your dog sits so that when people come over and your dog's running, you can control your dog. Uh,
yeah,
and so I think that's also, I don't think you can talk attachment without it being like the confusion you experience right now. There are so many threads,
mm,
I don't know what to pick. Because I think people opt for discipline and control and obedience when they themselves can't bear that confusion of there are so
mm,
many things to juggle and manage and it's too much. So I much rather just be able to say, sit, sit, lie down, don't go heel, lock my dog in the room for a bit, give him a
yeah,
timeout, shakes my hand
yeah.
when he wants, as opposed to bear the confusion and mess that attachment is, right?
Yeah.
And as I'm saying that, I'm thinking about Uh, I don't know, birth was coming to my mind, where birth is such a messy process,
Hmm.
but it's so intimate, and there is so much that one has to bear by while giving birth or even
Hmm.
carrying their baby, right? Um,
Hmm.
and I think that translates. I think people who can find in them to create that space to bear the mess of relating to another human or sentient being
Yeah.
will automatically find themselves in the throes of attachment as opposed to obedience and discipline and control.
Yeah.
Uh,
Yeah.
so, yeah, I think that, yeah, yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. I think I also think it's about, to me, I think the confusion, bearing the messiness, I feel like is perhaps like one step, like a level two. I think the level
Mhm.
one is how do we embrace the softness of attachment, right? Because again, I think that in the context of dogs, I think there is so much, and you're right, it is political, right? Because now we're talking about power structures, we're talking about ideas and notions of equality. We're talking about one person in this particular relationship having much more power, having much more authority, laying down the law of the land, so as to speak, to another person who is regarded as not equal, who is regarded as smaller, who's regarded as less of a being, right, in this
Mm.
relationship. And so when those politics kick in, um, it's also very hard to get in touch or be open so much to the idea of softness, right? Because I think softness in that sense perhaps has the ability to like dismantle these politics, dismantle these structures in so many different ways. And so I'm also thinking about how for a lot of people, this idea that I need to work on my attachment, or I need to work on my responsiveness, or I need to be more spontaneous, or even so much as I need to just figure out a way to meet my dog's needs, seem like, what are you even talking about? Because it's just like you said, control is so much easier. Control is so much more. You'd also, there's a sense of, mm, I don't have to feel to also be able to control. I just need to know that I am more powerful, or that I am in a position of power. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it does, and I think that's pretty spot on when you say I don't have to feel to control, because I think that's literally the defense that control serves. You
Yeah.
feeling feelings is so much that you much
Yeah.
rather just sort of simplify the equation, so to speak, and slip into control. But
Yeah.
it's interesting because there's a it's from whatever I've heard or seen of like trainers and what they say, or even this is common myth around ki, oh, this dog is trying to assert dominance. You have to be the alpha one in the room, right?
Yeah.
So it's
Yeah.
not as if, according to common myth or urban legend, whatever you want to call it, dogs are seen as the smaller, lesser beings. In fact, they're
Mm.
seen as somebody or something that is fighting you for power. And in
Yeah.
some way, I suppose that that's the fear, right? That, oh, they'll
Yeah.
bite me, or they'll do this, or they're so aggressive, they can do whatever they want. Um, as if, I don't know, like on the flick of a button, a dog can turn into a killing machine, right? Like,
Yeah.
uh, so then I think in that context, this idea of discipline, control, training is also reclaiming power that you are threatened
Mm.
will be taken away from you. So
Yeah.
I suppose, I mean, of course, I don't work with dog parents, so I don't know what all must could be driving that confusion and fear of softness of attachment. But I suppose that's the fear, that if I turn soft, am I going to lose my power? And is
For
this
sure.
other being going to have more power over me?
Yeah.
Um, and it's interesting that you said, laying down the law of the land, etc., etc., because um, these are also, I mean, I'm a psychologist, I'm going to bring gender in, but very masculine ideas.
Yeah, absolutely.
And
For
and
sure.
that's the other thing. Like in psychoanalysis, when we say mother, we don't necessarily mean female by birth. It's
Yeah.
the softer attachment, right? And you want to look at it biologically. I suppose the softness of attachment is also associated with a maternal because most
Mm.
mothers feed their babies, whether that's
Yeah.
animals or humans,
Yeah.
right? You're attached to the breast or to the teats of a
Yeah.
cow or whatever it is. So,
Yeah.
but I think that's a very, and which brings me to something else that I think in psychology as well, for humans, attachment is not, it's often looked at as just a two-person thing, but it's always a triad.
Mm.
There has to
Mm.
be the maternal, the paternal, and the baby.
Mm.
Now, whether that one person can embody both, that's a question to ask.
Mm.
But if there is one person laying down the law of the land, there must be another person or force or object that does the other,
Mm.
right? And vice versa. So when you were talking
Mm.
about laying down the law of the land, actually what was coming to my mind was your hand signal.
Mm.
Um, because there's a mix of softness there in terms of
Mm.
not screaming, yelling, saying no, but it's also a
Mm.
boundary
Yeah.
and it's a communication. Now, what you would know, what the dog reads is, does that mean they're saying this is dangerous, this is threatening, I
Yeah.
shouldn't move forward? Um, because, of course, the hand signals used in multiple ways. I've seen you use it for food as well. Now, that's more of your need than it is the dog's need to save the
Yeah.
dog from the food.
Yeah.
So it's not as if within attachment you can't lay down laws. You can,
Yeah.
but you can do it without a sense of control, obedience. Now, if we talk about the hand signal at the table, if
Yeah.
Luigi or Mutton would still persist, you would realize they're asking for some food and provide them with that. So even though you're
Yeah.
saying no, which is laying down the law and carrying out more of a
Sure.
paternal function, you also come back around and provide that sort of maternal function of softness and I'm going to pay attention to your needs. It's not
Yeah.
threatening to you that they want to eat what you want to eat,
Yeah. Yeah.
right? Um, yeah, those were some of my thoughts to this. But
Yeah. Yeah. Um, yeah, for sure. I think in what you were describing with like the types of attachment, I thought what was really there was something beautiful about what you said when you were describing secure attachment, and you said separation is bearable.
hmm,
And the reason why I thought that was really beautiful is because, again, um, there were, uh, there have been a bunch of different studies done now on dogs and their attachment styles and stuff like that. And I think one particular study talked about how dogs with separation related disorders, and my sense is, again, this wasn't detailed out in the study, but my sense is it essentially related to separation anxiety, right? Really fit into the insecure, anxious attachment cluster, right? Um, which I suppose would make sense. But what I really loved about the word that you used was bearable, because I think that in a lot of the cases that I work with, and especially when it comes to separation anxiety, um, I think the expectation from pet parents often is, I just want this to stop. Like, I don't want my
mhm,
dog to have issues. I want my dog to stop being anxious about separation, right? And when you said bearable, I think there was just this sense of acknowledgement that separation is hard,
yeah,
and that doesn't have to change. Like, we don't have to change that. But how we cope with it
yeah,
can perhaps differ. And the
yeah,
meaning that we draw from that separation can perhaps differ. But
yeah,
in no way does it mean that separation stops being hard. And I find that
yeah,
often, like, pet parents do have that expectation that My dog is having a hard time with us leaving today. I want him or her to be absolutely fine the next day. Right. And that's the place that I want to get to without acknowledging that separation is hard. Um,
Yeah, and I
yeah.
mean, that's true with humans also. I think so many people um, come with the wish and the hope, which is really a sign and of it being more of a plea of wanting to just immediately get better or be happy, so to speak.
Mm,
And I mean, of course, on one hand, that's a reflection of the sheer helplessness and unbearableness of whatever experiences they're carrying. But on the other, it's also a symptom of the world we live in, which is this
yeah.
very capitalist, pharmaceutical heavy, you take this pill and this will be gone, blah, blah, blah kind of world of quick fixes, basically. Where
Yeah.
I feel like, in general, our ability to bear certain experiences is shrinking, except for, which is again, which comes back to where soft attachment or slowing down and being
Mm,
able to feel your feelings
mm,
in the presence of another makes all of these unbearable things bearable again. That was one. And the other is, I think, what was coming to my mind was, you know, if you, in human experiences, birth in itself is a separation. That you're in the
mm,
mother's body and then you're suddenly out of it.
yeah.
Then once you're weaned off the breast, that's another separation. And life is full of these kind of separations. And something that was coming to my mind was that, again, Winnicott, who's done quite exceptional work in attachment in infants, has this idea of a transitional object, which
Mm,
is basically a blanket, a soft toy, it could be anything that the baby sort of associates with the mother, could be because of the smell, could be
mm,
because of the texture. And so, if the mother is away but the transitional object is around, it helps the baby to kind of separate because there's something reassuring and comforting. There is still some
yeah.
presence and absence, right?
Yeah.
And you'll find many equivalents of that through so many adult lives as well, like maybe needing a nightlight at night,
Yeah. Yeah.
maybe having a particular blanket or a particular hoodie that you
Yeah.
just cannot do without. Um, and oftentimes when I think like people leave or have to move abroad, they leave behind an object of theirs to
Mm,
their loved ones to hold on to. Right? So these
yeah.
are ways separation becomes bearable. And what I was remembering was, I think initially when Luchi had come in, there was some music that you'd found that would
Mm,
help her, right?
mm,
That's also some kind of a, if I can loosely call it that, a transitional object, that it
yeah.
was, there was some sense of presence. I don't know what Lucci made of that music, what it did
Yeah.
for her, but it
Yeah.
made y'all not being at home somewhat bearable for her.
Yeah. Yeah.
Um, so yeah, and I mean, I also felt curious because I wonder what it feels like to the dog to be left behind like that.
Mm,
Um, I mean, that's because it's not a child or a baby who you can explain to the concept
yeah.
of going to work or going to a party or whatever.
Yeah.
Um, so, I mean, yeah, I was wondering what uh,
Yeah. Yeah.
pet
I think
parenting is like
it's,
without.
yeah, absolutely. And I think it's a hard one, right? Because again, so many times, like, I've sensed and I've experienced the frustration of pet parents going like, I'm telling my dog I'm going to work. I am telling my dog that I will go, I will come back. I am doing this routine day in and day out. Um, and he still finds it hard. And I'm like, yes, because it is hard. Uh, you know, and I think it is that. I think it is I I also think I also think there's again, right, even here I'm experiencing like separation of what I mean, and just to sort of piggyback on what you're saying, I think separation of or a disconnection from someone's lived experience or something, right? So, for example, I think a lot of the times it's just that, oh, my dog is back at home. but there's also so much going on around the house without a pet parent being there, right? Like just now, for example, there are birds tweeting, there is traffic, there is some construction sound outside. All of this is happening in the space that I am in, right? And that continues to happen. And each of these things bring about different feelings and senses and connections and thoughts for dogs. So it's never just they're just at home, right? There's a
Yeah.
full day that's panning out for them in that time, which could also make separation really overwhelming, which could also, and I think again, it goes back to the fact of the scariness of the world is
Mm.
what they're encountering even when they're home alone. And they don't have that one person, they don't have that secure base to then return
Yeah.
to and find comfort in. And so separation can just feel very, very overwhelming as well.
Yeah, and I think like two things came to my mind. One, the more immediate one was, so what if your dog is feeling anxious when you're away and pees all over the house?
Yeah.
Um, like there's, I feel like saying entitled to have a response to that separation, right? Like if it were a
Yeah, yeah,
baby,
absolutely.
they
Yeah.
cry, scream, whatever. If the dog's continuously barking, and I think it's I don't know much about the dog care world, but I feel like these are problems, these are behaviors that have been deemed as problems by the training
Hmm.
community, right? Like these are
Yeah.
problems that need to be
Solved
eradicated.
and
Um,
fixed. Yeah. Yeah.
yeah, because like you said, separation is hard. So the dog is going to
Yeah.
have a response to it. And, similarly, in psychology, like at least my school of thought, we don't see symptoms as problems that need to be
Mm.
done away with. In
Yeah.
fact, they're symbols rather of something
Mm.
deeper, of how you can
Yeah.
communicate with another
Yeah.
person, right? I imagine if now the dog has peed all over, let's say that's the thing that they do when they're anxious. That's a symptom that when you come back, that I suppose the dog was either scared or overwhelmed and needs just a lot of connection and care in that moment, as
Yeah.
opposed to being scolded and whatever
Yeah.
else, or thinking like, now how do I make my dog stop peeing when I leave the house,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
One was that, and the second was, I think, I think this a lot because I always feel like I don't think I'd be able to get a dog simply because I wouldn't be able to devote
Mm.
that much time and care right now. And so maybe I should get a
Mm.
cat. But something that always stops me is, am I buying into the myth that cats don't require as much care as
Mm.
dogs? Like, I don't know. If I know anything about dogs, it's because of you. I don't know anything about cats
Yeah.
and their needs. And
Yeah.
now, if I get a cat and I find that a cat has somewhat similar needs to a dog, I'm going to be screwed because I don't have it in me to take care of a pet right now.
Yeah.
So I'm not getting
Yeah.
a cat. But I
Yeah.
think that's the idea, right? That people think even with dogs, you get a dog, you get a plaything, you get a cute, fuzzy little thing to have around.
Yeah.
And the more you interact with what a dog's actual needs are, the more you let yourself feel that the dog is a sentient being, the more demanding does the dog start
Yeah.
to get, which is so
Yeah.
overwhelming because you think
Yeah.
this is just going to be like something around the house that I can go to when I want a
Yeah.
cuddle or when I want a pet.
Yeah.
Um, but now, if the dog needs me 24/7, that's not what I signed up for. And I
Yeah.
imagine that must be so anxiety provoking,
Yeah.
and must drive a lot of reasons why difficult dogs get abandoned, right? Like, are they really difficult, or is it really overwhelming to realize that what you've brought home is a sentient being who needs you,
Yeah.
right? So,
Yeah.
and I think, which takes me to something else. I think for attachment, it's also very important that people are open to being needed and to
Mm.
needing.
Yeah.
I think needing has also become something that's been so problematized.
Yeah.
Having needs is a problem,
Yeah.
whether that's dogs or humans.
Yeah.
Um, and then add to that being needed also. Right?
Yeah.
Like in I see it as almost like a cycle where my needs are not being met, but somebody needs me, and I can't
Yeah.
show up for this person because there's nobody showing up for me. So it's empty cup, empty cup, empty cup everywhere.
Yeah.
And then
Yeah.
who has time for attachment or like building
Yeah.
an attachment?
Yeah.
Um,
Yeah, for sure. Absolutely. Absolutely. Yeah. And I think it's interesting you talked about like, hmm, it's interesting that you talked about and the reason why I'm mentioning is this because again, there are a lot of people who will end up who are watching or who will end up watching who very research driven. And so when you were talking about like attitudes, right? Like what symptoms versus problems that need to be fixed, there are studies to show that dog owners' attitudes towards their dog and towards the relationship with their dogs actually determine how they view problem behaviors, right? So if there is a dog parent, a caregiver who has a very secure relationship with their dog, who is in tune with their dog, they're less likely to see problem behaviors as problems, right? But and then the opposite of that is, when they're slightly more disconnected, when they don't have those foundations of attachment in place, of a secure attachment in place, and they're likely to see some of these behaviors as extremely problematic and really difficult and so on and so forth. And I thought it was interesting that you talked about like these attitudes because I also feel like what most folks end up doing is they sign up to bring home a dog into their space from a very functional perspective,
Mm.
right? From a very look perspective. And then once they get into it, they realize, oh shit, this is no longer functional. This is emotional and this is relational. And
I
um,
think human parents also do that.
exactly, right? Yeah, absolutely. It's, like I think it just the conversation on having kids for the sake of it versus really wanting to have kids, right? And I think people just realizing along the journey that, oh my God, like this is a lot more than just doing basics. And yeah, I absolutely love what Sajanya said here as well. Like the moment you have needs, you are labeled needy, right?
Yeah,
And I know that you and I have like taken Arnav's case on this so many times because he will often call Lucci a very needy dog. But I think there's just so much to like unpack over there as well, right?
yeah, and
His own,
you know,
yeah,
I think like this thing of realizing that this entails so much more than what I thought circles back to what I said at the beginning about a good enough caregiver is spontaneous because
yeah,
spontaneity is
for
not
sure.
just instant responses, it's also to be able to completely change your entire worldview or perspective if you're presented with new information, right? And
Yeah,
to abandon a stance you have can be so threatening for people
yeah,
psychologically that again you resort to control or obedience. And
yeah.
this idea of being labeled needy, like I remember for the uh, I think I read this somewhere recently about how unmet needs is something that starts feeling like greed, you know. Like
Mm,
I remember we start this conversation around Luchi a lot. If we keep feeding her, she'll just keep eating. It's like she'll never stop. But that's not true. She
yeah,
might keep eating to a certain point, but she's not going
yeah,
to eat beyond what she wants to eat or needs to eat.
yeah,
Or
yeah,
within Lucy's case, I'm going to stick to wants to eat.
yeah,
I think her wants are much bigger than her needs. But
yeah.
there's nothing wrong with that. Also, she's a desire-filled dog. I think that's great. Desire is also important. That's how you know you're alive when you want and long for things. But what was I saying? Yeah, but so I think, and again, I think hunger, and I don't just mean
Mm,
physical hunger, psychological
yeah,
hunger, needs
yeah,
are driven by hunger. Uh, is so that's one of the things that's psychologically very terrorizing for humans because
yeah.
when a need goes unmet for
So
babies they don't
long.
have a
Yeah,
sense of time, so when
yeah,
they're in need of something it feels like it goes on forever, which is why they're so like relentless in their crying
yeah.
and their need to be tended to urgently because it's only
Yeah.
when the need is met does the pain of like being hungry sort
Mm,
of subside, right? But
yeah.
now if that sort of need goes unmet, that terrorizing feeling is going on endlessly. So then when your
Yeah.
need starts to get met, there's such a backlog that it might take 1 month, 2 months, 6 months, 5 years
Yeah.
for those needs to feel fully met, and there's nothing wrong with that. Even with therapy, there's so much pressure for 18 sessions and fixed and
Yeah.
ready to like leave. But there is a
Yeah.
backlog of unmet needs, and
Yeah.
that could take up from 2 to 10 years. Who's to say? And then
Yeah.
there's the whole debate of, oh, but so much dependence, blah, blah, blah. But it's because there has been no room for any kind of dependence or attachment, that there's such a
Yeah.
deep need. And
Yeah.
I think something that was coming to my mind was whether that's pets, babies, clients, or patients for therapists. I guess until people are okay with their own needs
Mm.
and how deep they run, meeting somebody else's needs
Yeah.
is always going to bring up a world of feelings. That could be hatred, envy, anger, indifference. Nobody
Yeah.
met my needs, so why should I meet yours? That could be an unconscious narrative we don't know of. It could be
Yeah.
so many things. So I think it's important to kind of know what you're signing up for when you have a choice to be a caregiver. It's different when you're
Yeah.
thrust into that position.
Thrown into it. Yeah, for
Yeah.
sure. Yeah.
But
Yeah.
if it's a choice, like it is to adopt a dog, uh, I don't know if that's a problematic statement to make in dog communities, but I don't know. Is adoption a choice? Like bringing home
I
a
mean,
dog?
yeah, yeah, yeah,
Yeah,
you
okay,
can
okay.
choose to adopt versus choose to buy. So,
No,
which is
that's a
why,
separate conversation. But
huh?
anyway, never mind.
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
Right? Like, I think it's important to know what you're signing up for, what uh, it means besides just either getting a dog for a guard dog purpose or a, um, I don't know,
Yeah.
those teacup dogs that people want to ferry around in the handbags, right? Like,
Yeah.
yeah.
The disdain and your tone is just remarkable. Um, but okay, Biggie here had a comment which he left a while back, and I just saw it. I have an avoidant attachment style, and I believe that there is still attachment, or rather, the need for attachment. It's neurologically hardwired into us. Also, Heller and Levine attached raise an interesting point in that avoidant or anxious attachment can be a survival strategy, all depending on the circumstances.
Yeah.
Do you want to respond to this? Like,
No, I
yeah,
think
short
that's
thought.
true. I think the way I think of it as a survival strategy is sort of
Hmm.
um, you don't trust that the world around you can meet your needs, and it feels safer to be avoidant than to
Yeah,
be dependent and then maybe um, mistreated, misused, and just have your needs go on unmet. um,
yeah.
I think turning away from the world, it's like being a tortoise or a snail. You have your
Hmm.
shell
You retreat
that
back.
you
Yeah,
turn into. You retreat from the world because the world seems like it's not going to meet your needs. And I think Biggie is right. That doesn't take away the desire for attachment
yeah,
at all. Yeah.
yeah. Absolutely. And yeah. Hmm. Sajanya is saying, I think a lot of people are themselves not very attuned to their
Yeah.
attachment patterns and even a recognition of emotional needs. Absolutely, for sure. Yeah, and I think that we see this particularly, I think, um, you know, in so many ways when I do consultations with pet parents, and even in my own journey, like with Parks, right? I think that as I was, and I think we always get the two kinds of groups that when you are learning to meet the needs of your dog, it can throw up like a mirror. It throws up a mirror either
Mm-hmm.
way, right? Which is like, oh my God, I have needs that are unmet. And that relationship with your dog can either inspire you to also find ways to meet your needs and really think about your attachment pattern, think about what's going on with you, or it can feel so overwhelming and so um, scary to the point that I think it becomes unbearable, that you
Mm.
also then move away from it and then perhaps just retreat into that narrative of control and discipline.
because
Yeah.
um, there's also something about that narrative that leaves a part of yourself behind, you know?
Hmm.
Um, yeah.
What path do you think it leaves behind?
Oh wow, is this turning into therapy?
No,
Um,
I'm just curious.
I think it is that part, right? Like, I think what we spoke about, the confusion, the messiness, the vulnerability, the rawness of it. Um, right? Like, I don't, for example, I don't want to understand why my dog is having a hard time, because if I try to understand why my dog is having a hard time, then it might throw up things about myself. It might throw up things about my
Yeah.
relationship with my dog. It might throw up things about how I'm unable to meet their needs. That might throw up things about myself and, so many different things. So I think it becomes like this, very like messy pot of a lot of the themes that we've already spoken about.
Is that
Um,
something that comes up in your sessions with your pet parents and this clients in the sense of when they begin to understand the needs of their dogs? Is there a lot of guilt and shame that comes with that experience
yeah,
of
a
sort
big
of
part of it.
realizing what?
Yeah,
Hmm.
a big part of it. A big part of it. I think guilt and shame for a lot of them do come up, especially in um, I think it's especially and I see different groups, right? I see clients who just by conversation are able to experience that guilt and shame. In some cases, when we do video debriefs, for example, I'm able to sort of point out what they are doing that needs to be done differently, and that brings up a lot of guilt and shame. And then I think there are clients, and Saujanya, who's here, has spoken about it multiple times, who just exist in denial, right? Or who exist in a space where, when we talk, especially around like punishments, when we talk about courses or assertive versus methods of having dogs respond, a lot of them will come back saying, listen, I was punished as a child, I was hit as a child, or I was shamed as a child, I was scolded as a child. I turned out fine. So what's the issue with us doing it with our dogs? So we definitely do get those emotions as part of conversations, which is also very revealing about them, right? And so I think with each admission, I think the way that we support them and then building that kind of attachment looks very, very different. Um, I think that where there is guilt and shame, again, it's interesting where there is guilt and shame. I think sometimes we as consultants have to become that secure base for them, where
Hmm.
we have to provide them that comfort and source of attachment and security. And where there's denial, we have to also provide comfort and attachment and
Yeah.
security. But the way that we do it looks very different for both sets of people.
Yeah, I don't know what in particular about what you were saying was evoking this, but like I think like Biggie also pointed out, regardless of your attachment style, your need for attachment persists. We're social animals, right? As are
Yeah.
dogs. And and in that way, I think there is a resilience in humans and dogs
Hmm.
to make it through despite failures in caregiving, right? I think it's only when
Hmm.
it's constant failure,
Yeah.
and failure being a loose word here, but when it's constant failure from the get go, that it does really something catastrophic to either the
Yeah.
dog or the human being in question. But it's impossible to be perfect at meeting somebody's needs. There will be times, given your own
Yeah.
mental state or physical state, where you will be misattuned here and there, or you will not want to put in the work to reach something. But it's not as if that singular moment is going to define whether you've succeeded in meeting your dog's needs or not. It's a trajectory. It's the overall sense of
Yeah.
like, okay, 70% of needs have been met. And I think, which brings me to a quote that is on your merch, right? Like, I think while the narrative of late is shifting towards how do you provide care in a way, whether that's to babies or dogs, in a way where they thrive as opposed to just
Yeah,
surviving. I
yeah,
think that also somewhere, and it's a great movement. I think it's so important. Um, but at the same time, I think it somewhere ends up undervaluing how important it is to just have survived also.
yeah,
Like I think somewhere if your basics, which is
yeah,
food, water, shelter, are met and you are just surviving, that is also enough. So even whether
yeah,
that's like pet parents who are coming around to this form of caregiving or actual
yeah,
parents, right? I think to that guilt and shame, it's also important to know that your dog has survived. And with
yeah,
adopted cases, especially, right, like you do not know the
yeah,
survival rate.
yeah,
At least they sure, and
yeah,
there is a chance of something.
yeah,
Um, and yeah, I think even getting to a point where somebody is just surviving is a big deal. And
yeah,
once that survival can be taken for granted a little bit,
yeah,
can the sort of thriving begin,
yeah,
right? And
for sure.
that's where I think the resilience comes in, where you're resilient enough to wait, where you know that something to is being met, ki I'm still alive.
Yeah,
Um,
yeah,
yeah.
absolutely. Absolutely. Yeah. Okay, we've got a few more comments that I'm going to put here. Kritika says, I really resonate with the fact that you mentioned attachment is messy. There's a false misconception that everything proper is in order and whatever is not must not be proper, if that makes sense.
It does make sense. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah. I think
I have actually a really, I don't know why this evoked that thought, but what was coming to my mind was attachments like khichdi, in the sense that
mhm.
khichdi is used as a metaphor of sabka khichdi bana diya. But it's
Mhm.
actually, there is a process behind making khichdi. It's not
Yeah.
just a mess,
Yeah.
like I think attachments is a lot like that, where it is seemingly messy and sure everything is dumped together, but there is a process behind it.
Yeah.
Um, and it serves a process of soothing you. Khichdi is comfort
Yeah.
food also.
Yeah.
So I
For
don't know if
sure.
that made
Yeah.
sense, but yeah.
Yeah, yeah, for sure. And I think it's interesting as well, right? And because again in the dog space, I think so much of what is seen as proper versus improper comes from a view of obedience, comes from a
Mm.
view of good behavior. Um, and it's often assumed that if your dog behaves well, oh, then you have a great relationship with your dog.
Yeah.
Um,
Babies
right?
also.
But yeah, absolutely, right? But if your dog is not listening to you, if your dog is exercising agency, exercising free will, disagreeing with you, then clearly that relationship needs some work.
Yeah, and I,
Um,
I think that's so interesting that you brought that up because that loops back to what secure and safe attachment looks like.
mm,
Because, a professor of mine had said this that oftentimes parents will say, oh, you were such a good baby, you never cried. But there's nothing more heartbreaking than that because the only way a baby expresses its needs are by crying.
yeah,
So, what does it mean when a baby hasn't cried at all as a
yeah,
baby? No needs have
yeah,
been voiced because there's no hope that those needs will be met. So, why voice it at all? So,
yeah,
when a dog is misbehaving, at least
yeah,
there's security enough to attempt to express itself that way.
yeah,
Right? Like, there's nothing
absolutely.
sadder than an unresponsive baby or an unresponsive dog.
Yeah, for sure.
So I think that,
Yeah,
in fact, if we were to flip that narrative on its head, a quote unquote misbehaved dog is the dog that is a sign of a good relationship
yeah,
with the
absolutely.
parent.
Absolutely, absolutely, and I think yes, absolutely, because I think we say this a lot in especially like when we I mean I've experienced this obviously firsthand, and then with a lot of clients I've experienced this as well, where when they bring home a dog from a shelter, or they've brought home a dog who's literally been abandoned on the road, and they bring them home. Um, I often tell them that the signs of misbehavior or the signs of naughtiness is
Hmm.
your dog experiencing security and safety at home,
Yeah, yeah,
right? And I think
yeah,
we have to flip it to saying that because again, right, I encounter so many people who will say, oh, but my dog wasn't like this. My dog was very well behaved, didn't beg for food, didn't go into certain places.
congratulations that the dog is now not well behaved. Yeah, I would say. You
Yeah,
were doing
exactly,
something
right?
right.
Absolutely, and I think it takes it for them as well. I feel like it's such a jolt when I articulate that perhaps the dog was perhaps also shut down, right? There was
Yeah,
no space to articulate those needs. There was no safety to experience what they wanted to experience, and now there is safety to do that. And so, can we at least start there first, right?
yeah,
And can we use that understanding? Yeah.
and I think with dogs, right, like in particular, what gets labeled as being misbehaved, first of all, it's such a problematic categorization. But like I think of Lucci, where I suppose in another household this would be misbehavior when she wants
Mhm.
pizza and she stomps her hind legs, right? Like it's a
Yeah.
tantrum. And
Yeah.
how? There's an ambulance wailing, there are legs being stomped, there is her tongue going everywhere. But that misbehavior is also her character trait. Like I wouldn't
Yeah.
know Lucci as a dog without it,
Mm.
right? Otherwise,
Mm.
it's like having a stuffed toy. What is the difference between having a stuffed toy dog and an actual dog?
Yeah.
It's the way they
Yeah.
emote, they express.
Yeah.
So much of that misbehavior is just communication, and it's telling you who your dog is. If Lucci
Yeah.
did behave that way, we wouldn't know she loves the hell out of pizza, right?
Yeah.
Um,
Yeah.
so yeah, I mean, how else do you figure out what your dog's personality is if they're not
Yeah.
sort of coming
Yeah.
out and expressing themselves behaviorally?
Yeah. Absolutely. Okay, I have one more comment here. Saujanya says, I used to have a very anxious attachment style, but I've realized I've probably transitioned to somewhere around the avoidance style
Mhm.
when I sense a feeling that people are not showing up. And I'm glad I'm able to recognize that both are from a place of broken trust in the people around us to meet our needs or help us meet our needs. So this is
Yeah.
an interesting one, and I wanted to know your perspective on this. But do you find like that these attachment styles are fixed, or do you find that they are fluid? What is your take on that? Like, is it possible? I mean, I know that the reverse is possible, right? So, for example, even in how you were describing, um, I think you were talking about insecure attachment, and you were talking about scope for repair, right? And I would imagine even with avoidant, anxious, there is scope for repair. But is it like if you're securely attached, then you're securely attached, and that it doesn't change, or what is your take on that?
I don't think so. I also, again, I think like attachment styles are, um, I think they're resilient to some extent. It's a question of what you've
Mm,
experienced long time as opposed to them also not
mm.
being fluid enough to change with every interaction that
Yeah,
determines
yeah.
your thing. But I think it's important. Um, I don't know. I was thinking. I think there's somewhere in at least. I think the fate of an attachment style rests a lot on the capacity for hope, if that
Mm,
makes sense. If there is still hope that yes, the world has mostly been bad or broken me, but there might be one person or one thing out there that could
yeah.
also be a dog, or a cat, or a plant. Um,
Hmm.
that this thing gets me, even if humans can't.
Yeah.
There is hope. And that being said, I mean, I don't think, these are three types of attachment styles as opposed to being like a prize giving podium
Yeah.
of secure is first and this is second and this is
Yeah.
third, this
Yeah.
is great, this is bad, this is worse. It's
Yeah.
just a reflection of your relationship with the world, and that is what it is, and it can change. And it depends on what you want and what you're looking for and need out of your life. Some people can maybe even thrive with an avoidant
Yeah.
attachment style, right? So, yeah, I mean, of course, the world would feel fuzzy and warm if everybody was securely attached to one another, but that is not to say that that's the only right way of existing or the
Yeah.
only ideal way of existing.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
I think something else that's coming to me is that people have to be um, worthy of being securely attached to.
Hmm.
You know,
Yeah.
like, and you prove that worth, I suppose, by having some kind of goodness that stays more than your badness in very
Yeah.
simplistic terms.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
if you don't find people that seem worth that, then you live how you live till you find that person, thing,
Yeah.
dog, plant, cat. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah. And that's an interesting segue because I think I also wanted to sort of the last question, the last theme that I wanted to sort of close with on was how does one go about, I suppose, building the secure attachment? How does one find it?
As a caregiver or as on the other end?
Let's talk as a caregiver because I think
I mean, I
that
think
might be more helpful. Yeah.
it's showing up,
Hmm.
is what I would say. And then to break it further down and really simplify it is, I think, like with buildings, the foundation is what matters. And the
Hmm.
foundation, I think, in an attachment style is the structure.
Hmm.
So for with dogs, for instance, um, them being able to trust and take for granted that they're going to get their big meals for sure,
Hmm. Yeah.
that they're going to have a place to pee and poop, that they're going to have a place to sleep. These are the basics, right? And
Yeah.
to know that they will be fed on time when their sort of clock strikes.
Yeah. Yeah.
Um, that's the structure to the structural needs, I suppose, the first to meet those consistently. And then you add the
Yeah.
layers to it.
Yeah.
Right, like
Yeah.
even with babies, it's being fed, having their diapers changed, knowing that the
Mm.
caregiver is going to show up when they have a need.
Yeah.
In therapy, so much of the healing actually happens just by knowing that this
Showing up.
time of the week of the day I have a session.
Yeah. Yeah.
Right, so I think it's really the security comes from the structure, uh,
Yeah.
and then the rest falls in because once you trust somebody to be consistent and reliable,
Yeah.
the rest kind of falls into place. And then that's where, it's not like one single thing of you having failed is going to completely change my attachment style to you.
Yeah.
Can I
Yeah.
trust you for the big picture or the base
Big stuff.
picture, for the sort of like bones
Yeah.
and skeleton of it? Um,
Mm. Mm.
so I think that comes from showing up and being around.
Yeah.
That's
Yeah.
why so
Yeah.
many caregivers take a sabbatical after having a baby. That's when the baby needs you the
Yeah.
most.
Yeah. Yeah. For sure. Yeah. Biggie had one more comment. Apart from hope, I believe it also needs acceptance, acceptance for what is and what is possible based on my attachment style. We need to take it from there with ourselves and with our dogs. Anything else
Mhm.
only results in judgment and pressure. Yeah,
Yeah, I
for
think
sure.
that's true. And I
Yeah,
think that's a very intuitive way of providing care for yourself and
yeah,
somebody else to know your limits. And
yeah,
because sadly, as human beings, we don't have all the power and all the ability
yeah,
and magic or love to give. And
yeah, yeah,
knowing our limits can be heartbreaking, but also freeing. And that's what acceptance is,
Mm.
right? You grieve what you can't do or can't have and work with what you do.
Yeah,
And like I said, secure attachments aren't the ideal. And
yeah,
it's okay to have other forms of attachments, or it's okay to not be at that ideal of either caregiving or whatever.
yeah, yeah,
Um, it's yeah, I think knowing your limits is a very intuitive
yeah,
and helpful way of caregiving, actually.
yeah, yeah. And I think that it also, because again, I feel like I love how you've emphasized that it's secure attachments is not ideal, because I think there is a sense to want to get better, want to do more.
It's not
It
the
feels like
ideal.
there. It's not the ideal, like as in it's not,
Yeah,
you know, we I think somewhere somehow we place it on this pedestal
yeah,
that everybody has to get to,
yeah,
irrespective of where people currently are, right? And it doesn't work like that.
yeah,
It's not like an end goal per se to meet, right? I think that there is, um, I think if at all we have to get there, everybody will get there at their own pace and time, and they need so many things for that to come into place, right? But I also think that especially when it comes to caregiving for another sentient being, um, you have to do what you can with what you also have, right?
yeah,
And I think you
yeah,
talk about limits, I think they're boundaries, whatever you may call them, right? At the end of the day, and it's not to say that within what you have, like it's less or it can't be
yeah,
enough for everyone involved there.
yeah. And I think like that just wraps it up really well, because I don't think attachment is a one-way ticket to ever being free of grief.
Yeah,
There will
yeah,
always be losses, there will always be something to have grieved or to
yeah,
grieve. Um, and that's also part of any sentient being's life.
yeah, yeah,
You cannot avoid loss, you cannot avoid grief. So even if
yeah,
you are the most securely attached person in the world, does not mean you
yeah,
are not going to have pain and discomfort and heartbreak.
yeah,
So
yeah.